The period of witch trials in early modern Europe were widespread moral panic, suggesting that malevolent satanic witches were organizing threat to Christendom during the 15th and 16th century. The victims accused of witchcraft were portrayed as being worshipper of the devil, who engaged in such art of malevolent sorcery, in traditional ceremony known as Sabbath. Year 1580 to 1630 are marked as the peak of the witch hunt in the European history, though the hunt declined in the early 18th century. Over the entire duration of the phenomenon of some 3 centuries, an estimated total of between 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed. The witch trial emerged in the 15th century out of the practices regarding the persecution of heresy in the medieval period, though they reached the peak with the rise of the religious war followed by the Protestant Reformation. From the 15th century, the idea of a pact became important. One could be possessed by the devil and not responsible for one's actions, but to be a witch, one had to sign a pact with the devil, often to worship him, which was heresy and meant damnation. Witch trials were most common in Central Europe, in Germany, France, Switzerland. Witch trials were somewhat less common in Scotland, Scandinavia and Poland. Executions for witchcraft were less common in England, Russia and Southern Europe. Furthermore, the frequency of witch trials varied over time. In Western Europe, the first witch hunts were held in France and Germany in the 15th century. In the 16th century, the witch mania spread to England and Scotland. In Western Europe, witch trials reached a peak in the late 16th century and early 17th century, then declined gradually. However, in Scandinavia, the majority of executions for witchcraft took place in the late 17th century, later than in Western Europe. In Poland, witch trials reached a peak in the late 17th century, when they were declining in Western Europe. In Hungary, people were not executed for witchcraft until the early 18th century, when witch trials and executions were imposed by the Austrians. There is no actual explanation of why witch trials became common during the late 15th and 16th century. Several books were written about witchcraft. The most notorious is the Malleus Maleficarum, commonly known as Hammer of Witches, which was first published in 1486 and was written by 2 Dominicans, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer. The book was considered as one of the significant tools to initiate dreadful punishments that imposed on the victims during the trials. Punishments were different for different countries, but they were equally dreadful. Many evidences from historical trials has left the instances of deaths caused by the tortures during the interrogation in the trials. Sometimes the tortures during the trials turned out so horrible that victims were said to have died even before the punishment. Even children were tortured for being suspected as witches. Beliefs about witchcraft varied. Some people who believed in witches believed that they held nocturnal meetings called Sabbath. At the Sabbath they did wicked things like dancing naked, indulging in orgies and carrying out a parody of the Catholic Mass. Witches were even supposed to kill babies and eat them. Most people believed that witches could fly. According to some authorities, there were certain ways to identify a witch. Devil's Mark. The mark is supposedly given by the devil to them during the Sabbath. The mark was insensitive to pain. Pricking test. One test for a witch was to prick their body with a blade. If they did not flinch or bleed when pricked in a certain place, then it was evidence that they were a witch. Swimming test. Many people believed in swimming witches. If a witch was thrown into water, the water would reject them and they would float. If they sank, they were innocent. Prayer test. Medieval wisdom held that witches were incapable of speaking scripture aloud, so accused sorcerers were made to recite selections from the Bible, usually the Lord's Prayer, without making mistakes or omissions. Touch test. The touch test worked on the idea that victims of sorcery would have a special reaction to physical contact with their evildoer. In cases where a possessed person fell into spells or fits, the suspected witch would be brought into the room and asked to lay a hand on them. Incantation. Also known as charging, this test involved forcing the accused witch to verbally order the devil to let the possessed victim come out of their fit or trance. Moreover, the victims who had to face this tests were generally poor working-class women, old-aged widows, midwives. More and more people in the 17th century and early 18th century opposed the use of torture to obtain confessions, not necessarily because it was cruel but because it was not a reliable way of gaining information. As a result, the witch hunt collapsed. Some Protestant scholars also pointed out that popular beliefs about witches had no support from the Bible. Furthermore, most people also became skeptical about cases where witches were supposed to have used magic to kill people. Increasingly, people realized that the deaths might have been due to natural causes and they required proof that were not. People did not necessarily stop believing in witches, at least not at first, but they became much more cautious about accepting evidence of witchcraft, realizing that many maladies and mishaps have natural causes. Eventually, however, educated people gradually stopped believing in witches and magic. During the 18th century, it became fashionable to regard witchcraft as just a superstition. In England, the last execution for witchcraft was in 1682. By 1736, attitudes had changed so much that laws against witchcraft were repealed in England. They were replaced by a law that made it illegal to pretend to cast spells or tell fortunes. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe was in Bavaria, Germany in 1775.